Good afternoon and welcome to the COPS Tribal Methamphetamine webinar. The webinar series is a product of Strategic Applications International in conjunction with the Department of Justice COPS Community-Oriented Policing Office. And we'll begin here shortly. The topic today is meth identification and awareness, but we're actually going to be talking about the methamphetamine threat. Let you know that this service includes a feature that allows audio and any documents and other materials exchanged or viewed during the session to be recorded. By joining the session, you automatically consent to a webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to let our participants know that the audio portion of today's webinar will be available along with the accompanying PowerPoint presentation on methpedia.org. That's methpedia.org. Under our Community-Oriented Policing webinar series. You'll find the audio files and presentations of previous webinars in that series also. You'll be in the listen mode only. At the end of the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to participate in a question and answer session. Your Q&A session will occur after the presentation. You'll be able to submit questions online. To submit a question to presenters, please select the Q&A drop-down box and type your question in the box, then click on the word send. You can also use the chat section to send us questions also. Afterwards, we'll be doing some polling to survey the webinar. We ask you that you answer the polling questions. There'll be a total of 7. At the end, they'll show up down in the right-hand part of the presentation. We'd like you to, today's views are my views and not necessarily the views of Strategic Applications International in the COPS office, which sponsors the COPS Tribal Methamphetamine grants for 2010 and 2011. So to begin our series, it'll be the COPS Tribal Webinar Series. My name is Anthony Colson. I am a consultant for Strategic Applications International and a retired Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Drug Enforcement Administration out of Tucson, Arizona. Today we're going to take you from Mexico to all the way through into the tribal areas in terms of how methamphetamine is trafficked. To understand this, we know that there are 2 types of sources for methamphetamine, one from Mexico, which is the overwhelming source of methamphetamine into the country, and also from clandestine laboratories that are predominantly now, almost 90% of all laboratories are the one-bottle shake-and-bake method, which was the subject of our previous webinar. And we're not going to touch on meth labs so much because we've already done that. If we need to go back to it, we can. By going to you can go to the Methpedia website and view that webinar. But we're going to talk about how methamphetamine gets up and into your reservations and throughout the United States. And we're going to do that by talking about Mexico first because to get a sense of what the border is like and what the threat is. As you look at Mexico, Mexico has a number, the geography of Mexico is very simple. There are the mountain ranges in the middle create natural funnels on the east side of the Sierra Madre Oriental and on the west side of the Sierra Madre Occidental, which create natural funnels into the strongest drug trafficking corridors, which is South Texas, the Arizona and California borders. Not so much from the Big Bend area all the way into New Mexico, although drug trafficking comes through that area in large numbers, not to the extent that we see through those natural funnels in Mexico, and we'll have a graphic to show you exactly what that means. The background here is drug trafficking is controlled by the cartels there, and we have a list of cartels. And back in the day, as far back as the mid-2000s, basically controlled by 4 cartels along the border. The Tijuana cartel, which is the Arellano Felix group, which is right here. The Juarez cartel, which is Amado, that is Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, which had the Juarez area right here. And you had the Ocio Cardenas, which was the Gulf cartel, who allied himself with the Zetas. Now those cartels were the controlling factors, along with the Sinaloan cartel, which was made up of Chapo Guzman and primarily Chapo Guzman at this time. The other members have kind of all gone away for our purposes. So up to mid-2007, and I'll tell you why I picked that date, this is kind of where the areas of control were for those cartels. And we provided some of the names to those folks that were in those cartels. Mid-2007 is when there was a real competition for the areas. And it all started with, almost back in this area, this was such a lucrative smuggling corridor for the Sinaloan cartel. Because the Sinaloan cartel was different and based far down into Mexico, the control for the border was actually 300, 400 miles off the border, where these other cartels sat right along the border. This area was a very lucrative trafficking area, so the competition began in here with a little bit of violence back in 2006. It really became something in mid-2007 when actual war was declared between all these cartels against each other. And war was declared primarily by Chapo Guzman against the other cartels. His move began in 2007 for his control of the entire southwest border. The next, what happened in the violence is this, and we caution that some of the next slides may be a little bit graphic, where we try to keep a distant view of them, but this violence became very important because of some of the issues with messaging. And one of the things that we want to show you is right here. When the violence began and the competition for the border began, we started seeing these narco messages on there, which were pretty substantial pieces of information for us. These messages told us who was coming and who was going in terms of the cartels, and who was committing the violence. So it was a very big piece. And I'm sorry for the graphic nature of these, but this is what we have seen, along the border, especially on a daily occurrence in Juarez. So there's a picture of Chapo Guzman. And in 2007, we had a split within the Sinaloan cartel. And this split was that Beltran Leyva here, which is down here in the bottom, Arturo Beltran Leyva split out from the Sinaloan cartel because Arturo Beltran Leyva became a threat to the Sinaloan cartel and to Chapo. What surprised us all was this emergence of the La Familia down in this Morelos area, which had a real in with methamphetamine trafficking and was probably a big one. This one emerged quite quickly, and one the Mexican government really took after the most, unfortunately, leaving the Sinaloan cartel somewhat alone. So by 2008, we had this type of mess here in terms of cartels out there and working. The Gulf cartel, Ocio Cardenas was actually captured. Their alliance with the Zetas, the Gulf cartel started to disappear, and the Zetas became more powerful in this Gulf cartel area. You had the Juarez cartel. Chapo Guzman began his war, and he did so by taking on the Juarez cartel in Juarez, in Ciudad Juarez. And we've all heard about all the violence in Ciudad Juarez. And this was just a ruse. This was a way for Chapo Guzman to pull Mexican military and Mexican law enforcement away from his methamphetamine laboratories and his growing areas in the Sinaloa part of Mexico. And so it was not for drug trafficking. It was not for control of that area for drug trafficking. It was simply to draw Mexican military and law enforcement resources away from his growing and production areas, therefore strengthening him, using up Juarez cartel resources in the meantime, and knocking the Juarez cartel down by drawing law enforcement into this area. At the same time, law enforcement was taking on the Arellano Felixes by capturing them, and virtually the Tijuana cartel disappeared overnight. So that we ran into these are the things that were happening on the Zeta side, the messaging that was going on. And I want to show you this. This is actually a message to the cops towards the violence. I want to bring you up to today, and this is what today looks like in Mexico. A portion of the area of South Texas, those parts of the border that affect South Texas, are controlled by the Zetas. The Gulf cartel no longer exists in any form or fashion. The Juarez cartel has disappeared, and the Tijuana cartel has disappeared. And the Sinaloan cartel has established control throughout most of Mexico, making Chapo Guzman the most significant drug trafficker in the world. What is also happening, and I'll put this emerging alliance, and this is something to watch for over this next year, is that knowing that Chapo Guzman has established this control over Mexico, we have seen the children of the Carrillo Fuentes', Vicente's children, and Amato's children, begin an alliance with Vicente being the broker, with the Zetas and the remnants from the Beltran Leyva organizations. And so over the year and through this next election, we'll see some significant activity as it pertains to this emerging cartel, to see whether they can reestablish control and get the government to turn on the Sinaloan cartel after this next election. A picture that is public, which shows a lot of cartels, but actually, as I go back, really only two cartels control Mexico at this time. The Zetas, which began as a paramilitary force, and that has grown up and become very violent. They're now into extortion and all types of crimes besides drug trafficking that primarily impact South Texas areas. Chapo Guzman in the middle here, a seizure of $200 and some million out of one place, didn't have an impact on him whatsoever. This picture down in the right-hand corner is a picture of pseudoephedrine, seizures of pseudoephedrine by the Mexican police. And this is a big part of coming in. Pseudoephedrine from China, because Mexico banned pseudoephedrine in 2006, 2007. We've seen now pseudoephedrine coming up through Central America into Mexico. So it had a great impact on trafficking during those years. It had a great impact on use, the ban on pseudoephedrine, but Chapo Guzman found a way to navigate around that and get his supply of pseudoephedrine, and now ramping up methamphetamine production larger than he's ever had before. A good look at a picture of routes for your use in future times. What we want to say is that the old routes of smuggling through the Caribbean have increased, and now we see more and more activity heading out the Pacific area up into Central California in terms of drop zones. So that's Mexico in a nutshell. Good look at laboratories along the way. The final thing I want to say about Mexico is any illusion that you think that the Mexican government controls Mexico is simply an illusion. Mexico is controlled by two groups. The very wealthy, the wealthy 200 families of Mexico, the Mexican oligarchy, and the drug cartels. They control what happens in Mexico. The government does not control hardly anything that happens in Mexico, only in Mexico City. So let's move towards the southwest border, and we're going to show you a few pictures of what the southwest border looks like. That's in Nogales, the city of Nogales. That's what the fencing looks like in Nogales. Just outside, a majority of our border looks like this. You see the new fencing coming in, which allows wildlife to go through, and these are the old Jersey barriers that exist much along the border. And another picture, this is out along our borders, especially on the west side of the west of the Rio Grande in Texas. And these barriers just prevent vehicles from coming through, do not prevent people or anyone like that. This is a gate on the Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation, and you can see the gate is open for members to pass freely through that gate in and out of Mexico. So the border is very porous, and the message here is that there is no amount of Border Patrol agents, there is no amount of law enforcement, there's no magic fence or fencing scheme that you can say will control the border, the egress and ingress into different areas. So what we'll do is, what I show you is charts and show you what's happening along the southwest border is a good example. Marijuana, which fuels all other drug trafficking. So methamphetamine trafficking from Mexico cannot exist without marijuana. Marijuana is the cash, the fuel that drives all other drug trafficking into the United States. And you can see, Meth has controlled Texas, Sinaloa cartel controls Arizona and California. And that has grown over the years in terms of the numbers. And calendar year 2011 numbers, which I don't have up there, show an even greater amount of seizures increasing. Cocaine, as you can see, again, this cocaine is a Zeta feature, very much in South Texas, growing in California in exponential numbers because the Sinaloa cartel has taken over that California corridor. Heroin, there's never been more heroin on the streets of America than there has been at any time in our history. And that's unfortunate. Methamphetamine, you can see methamphetamine growing. And again, where the Sinaloa cartel controls most of the methamphetamine trafficking, you see the seizures rising in California. And one thing that I want to talk about in terms of these charts is this is seizure information. This is the amount of dope in pounds that has been seized by law enforcement in those states, that entire state, those states that border Mexico. And although seizures aren't a great indicator, are not a very good indicator of how much dope is coming in, I should say, not a great indicator of success, it is an indicator that there's a volume, where the volume has increased in what parts of the area of the country it's coming in. And roughly, from my experience, is that law enforcement is successful in seizing about 20% of what the product is that comes into the United States, and that comes from the traffickers themselves. So these numbers here represent the number of, in pounds, the total number of pounds of drugs seized by all of law enforcement in the 4 states. Pounds, they're in pounds, not kilos, of drugs seized. Money all over the place, and I want to put this example up. Just in Arizona alone, we can guess if we seize 50% of all the drugs that came into the country, the amount of cash per day that goes back into Mexico in cash, just in Arizona alone. So through areas of Oklahoma, Arizona, California, these numbers are staggering. And this is the amount of currency sitting in a car, transiting your areas that is heading back to the southwest border on a daily basis. It's a staggering amount of money. In the United States, we took this from ONDCP. It was a map to represent where Mexican cartels have a foothold, where they have a presence in the United States. And every green dot represents a presence where the cartels have in the United States. And I'll get to this a little bit. One of the areas that we have here is the fact that think of cartels, this in the United States, this presence actually is more akin to a car dealership as you know it. A car dealership that has a relationship with the manufacturer, like General Motors, to acquire vehicles. And then they sell those vehicles, and General Motors gets a certain amount of money back. The dealership gets a certain amount of money back. But at any one given time, that car dealership can say, you know what, we don't want to sell General Motor products anymore. We want to sell Ford. And can switch allegiance to where they get their product from, depending on what they can sell. So the relationship isn't so much a hierarchy that there is someone saying, okay, in Bismarck, North Dakota, or in Minneapolis, you work for our cartel. It's more of a relationship of we get product from that cartel, and so we're beholding to pay a certain amount of money back. And if we're successful as a business and we sell lots of product, the cartel keeps supplying us product. If we're not successful in selling product and we run a loss, then the cartel will shut us down because we're not making any profit for them. So please look at this in terms of a relationship is not that you have command and control infrastructure in all these cities. You have a relationship of selling a product more than you work for a boss somewhere in that city that belongs to the cartel. Well, let me, in my map here, in terms of, as I showed you, the huge areas where drugs come into the country, especially methamphetamine. And what I want to do here is show the flow of, how we get to your tribes in terms of the drugs coming in. From the Southern California side, coming in right in from Tijuana into the San Diego area, pretty much does not stop in San Diego, but heads up to Los Angeles, where drugs are then stashed and then distributed again throughout the country, primarily north, up the 5 freeway, out the 15 to Las Vegas, and that's one route, and then across I-40, which is the major ingress into the United States. The most important thing about California, Arizona, and southern Texas is the cartel's access to pavement. Once you get into the freeway system, which is relatively close to the border area, once you can get on pavement, and out of the desert areas, out of the remote areas onto pavement, you're pretty much in the bloodstream of America, and it's pretty difficult to then get this disease out of your bloodstream through interdiction. Although in most cases, in most of the reservations, highway or traffic interdiction is the most important and probably the best way to reduce the amount of drugs coming into Native American or Indian country lands. So we have that in Southern California. Here it goes right through Arizona, right past Tucson, primarily into the Phoenix area. We see very few drug loads transit I-10 across the country to the East Coast markets. What we do is we see it go up to I-17 to I-40, and then I-40 across into, and then back into these markets on the eastern seaboard primarily. So that's the big piece. The big piece, which affects Oklahoma the month, is Oklahoma City. What we call the I-35, the Big I, where we have a number of interstates transiting middle part of America to where a number of routes then emerge to the East Coast and to the north. And so our Oklahoma tribes, Quapaw, Wyandotte, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Citizen Potawatomi, Osage, really are in the midst of a huge corridor of trafficking. A lot of drugs, the nation's drugs, pass by those tribes on a daily basis, as well as Pasquayaki in Arizona, Gila River, Colorado River, and Navajo. A majority of the drugs that enter the United States navigates through those reservations. And in California, the same with Los Coyotes down in San Diego County. So those are impacted by this huge transshipment of drugs into the different areas. And as we further move in, and then we take a look at meth, demethamphetamine or methamphetamine that comes up from Mexico. This is a picture of methamphetamine from a 60-pound seizure that was made. You get this glassed out, and I'll go back, this glassed out, shard version of methamphetamine. As it goes down the line, this becomes more powdery, more in terms of little rocks and crystals as it gets to its distribution points, primarily in Indian country. So if you're getting something like this, we have a serious problem. Usually as this breaks down and is distributed, it looks a little bit different in terms of powder. And most of law enforcement has seen that type of methamphetamine. Into Indian country, and I want to talk about distribution centers in those areas. What we have is on the West Coast, and I put a dot where our grantees are for this grant in terms of how they're affected. And these little circles, and I'll start from down here. Las Vegas impacts, the most of stuff comes through Las Vegas and then spreads out, in different areas to Salt Lake, to different parts of to Reno, and then on to Salt Lake, goes this way and this way. And so you have this impact on this West Coast trafficking of these cities become feeders and very important to some of these areas. From here up to Seattle, and then from Seattle outward to the other locations, Spokane, back into Oregon, and down. And on the way, we drop into these areas here. Although Northern California, Yurok, Koopa experience a lot of methamphetamine labs up in those areas, and the same with Eugene. areas around Eugene. So those are one piece of what we have. Up in the northern part of the country, Kansas City becomes a big piece. Drugs come into Chicago, then up into and hit Keweenaw Bay, up into Minneapolis, and then from Minneapolis it spreads out begins to spread out to all our tribes, to Sioux Falls, to Rapid City, to Bismarck, and the such. So it goes into these major distribution centers and then gets farmed out in there. And I'll make a point about all these circles and dots. The same with ours into Salt Lake, or from the Denver area into these reservations in the north in terms of Wind River, Crow, and some of our other reservations in Montana. Salt Lake and Denver become suppliers of these reservations here. So you see your relationship with the larger metropolitan areas in terms of who supplies you. Same with Kansas City, Oklahoma City, primarily a lot in terms of Chickasaw and the tribes, a lot from Dallas, coming up through from Houston into the Dallas area, right off the southwest border for this methamphetamine and coming in. Although with Oklahoma and Kansas, a huge, huge issue with one-pot methods. And in some of these tribes, the domestic-produced methamphetamine is more significant than Mexican-based methamphetamine. And one of the issues that we have with that is, although domestic-produced methamphetamine may not represent, it does, a small amount compared to the Mexican methamphetamine that's coming into the country. Domestically produced is relatively a small amount. But because of the toxicity and the dangers with the production of these one-pot methods, they become astronomically more expensive in terms of outcomes, burning down houses, people in hospitals, danger to children, danger to the environment in terms of on the ground. Those are big questions. So those issues become are big for those tribes. So even though domestic produced is less of a threat, the way it is produced becomes a huge threat to your communities. Down in the Arizona part and Southern California, again, their impact, they're coming directly in from Mexico into some of these areas. In Arizona, it goes into Phoenix and then comes back to Tucson, to the Pasco Yaqui, back to Gila River, out to Navajo, and unfortunately, Colorado Indian Reservation gets impacted by both Phoenix and Las Vegas. So that's, we're getting back to the end. The only thing I want to, and I'll go back to some of these, the point I want to make with these, with the fact that you're impacted by major metropolitan areas, is the fact the problem is in terms of relationship and creating working relationships between your tribal police, your tribal governments, and those metropolitan areas in terms of law enforcement, because what is a priority for you in terms of meth trafficking may not be a priority for someone in Rapid City or Sioux City or Sioux Falls or Milwaukee or San Francisco, because the problem becomes there's so many more traffickers, so much more dope. The problem is that your ounce or pound dealer that's coming to your hotels and casinos and doing trafficking there aren't a priority in a big city, but they're a priority for you. And somehow you have to manage to get help from those larger metropolitan areas, law enforcement, to prioritize those traffickers that are going out to your reservations, because they have a more significant impact once you knock them off and eliminate them from the traffic. They will have more of an impact on the health of your community than not. So it's a tough trick, and it's hard to do, but it's one of the more necessary things to do for your law enforcement to get other big areas to see and be responsible for some of the priorities that you have in your areas. So that's a big piece. And finally, what I'll finish with is we have not had a real dialogue on trafficking for a very, very long time. And unfortunately, big events happen. The last time we had a huge dialogue was when Len Dias died of an overdose. We have to have those dialogues again on making it not a law enforcement issue, but a public health issue. And even though we made fun of Nancy Reagan and Just Say No, we need someone to get up and just say, hey, that we need to work on these pieces from a national perspective. So that's it for the things. We have questions, and let me see on the question part. Chat, I'm getting your questions now. Here we go. And if you put the questions and answers in the dialogue box, we'll put that up there. From non-border states, there have been many effective statewide initiatives to reduce trafficking, or has it mostly been local efforts? For non-border states, it's mostly the effective statewide initiatives have been local efforts designed to both eradicate the drug trafficking that's coming in and building different parts of the community, neighborhood watches, community coalitions. Those have been the most effective when working together. For instance, here is taking a look. You have to do a lot of research and taking a look at where your problems are, where you're having drug overdoses, where you're having domestic violence that are drug related, and then you take those and you start working on them in terms of your community, building lighting, street lighting for certain areas, higher incidence of patrols in those areas, working with students to do prevention efforts. Those areas are where we've seen the best results in terms of building community resiliency while working with law enforcement to knock trafficking down. As I told you, unfortunately, there are more drugs coming into this country than we've ever had before. Our drug use patterns from the National Household Survey shows an alarming increase in drug usage. So it is community-based where we have different areas that we work with. Another question that we have is, do Sinaloa cartels and Zetas take different approaches to trafficking across the border, or are they similar? They're very similar in how they do their trafficking. The Zetas are a little bit more ruthless in terms of the violence. Sinaloa cartel, more businesslike, but once they get across into the United States, the trafficking becomes the same. And I'll go back to my car dealership. It doesn't matter, what kind of product you sell in terms of a vehicle. Pretty much all the car dealerships act and behave in the same way, and their pricing is very competitive with each other. And so that's what we have in terms of trafficking stuff. A little bit different than actually looking and seeing what dope looks like, but we wanted to tell you what the threat was. And one of the things that we really want to talk to you about is that the amount of drugs isn't lessening. It all is dependent upon you becoming very, very engaged in a community solution, working with law enforcement, working with your treatment, working with your prevention partners in each of your tribal areas, to make your tribal areas more resilient to trafficking. The amount of drugs out there that are available are increasing. They are not going down. The seizure charts that we showed you shows a lot of success in seizing, but when you put that together with the price of the drugs, which is low, and the purity of those drugs, which is high, you come up with the answer that there is a lot of drugs available on the street, more than there's ever been in the United States. And that's something that the only solution to this is a prevention treatment posture of really trying to fix why people move to use drugs and how we can fix those folks out there, and not so much a law enforcement solution. What I do, that concludes our questions. I will run through. What is the most common form of transit, semis or vehicles? Let me tell you, with marijuana, it is outside the ports of entry and usually backpacked across by groups of illegal immigrants. What we do have is through the ports of entry, which is our major threat for methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin. Our major threat for drug trafficking is through the ports of entry, and that is done in all types of vehicles, people walking through, in produce, in semis and tractors and trailers. So that's a big issue. So those ports of entry are big. So no matter what you have along the border, putting more people, higher fences, more technology will not solve the issues of the problems on each of your reservations in Indian country lands. So that is what I have. If there are any more questions, post them. Let me say that we have polling, which will begin at this point. We're open polling, which will be in the right-hand corner. Please fill out the 7 questions for us, and we appreciate your time on there. On behalf of the Strategic Applications International and COPS office, we appreciate you taking the time today for our webinar. You can email me if you have additional questions, and you can go to methpedia.org and find this presentation on that thing, and on Methpedia on the website. And if you need more information, you can contact me, and we'll talk. So we appreciate your time, and if you could fill out the polling questions, we would appreciate it. Thank you.